On top of the arid hill, before 30 men with grimy hats and eyes closed to the past, she stood in silence. Not a word. Only the wind cutting through the red cliffs of northern Arizona. Until, in a gesture no one expected, the old rancher removed his hat, raised an improvised white flag, and walked toward her. Ayanna had seen 50 winters pass over these lands. 50 times she had watched snow cover the distant peaks while her hands healed wounds and her words preserved stories that school textbooks would never tell. A respected healer among the Navajo, she rarely spoke in public. Today would be different. The March sun beat mercilessly on the small wooden platform hastily erected near the dirt road. The auctioneer, a thin man in a sweaty black suit, adjusted his papers while checking his pocket watch for the third time. The Great Depression had reached even this forgotten corner of the territory, and ancestral lands were now commodities with prices attached. Benjamin Crawford watched from the shade of his weathered Ford truck. At 62, the rancher carried on his face the marks of decades fighting drought, low cattle prices, and now this economic crisis that devoured everything. His faded blue eyes had seen many battles, some of which he preferred to forget. Especially those involving the native peoples of this region. "Gentlemen, let's begin," shouted the auctioneer, wiping sweat from his forehead. Lot number 17, 400 acres of land on the eastern foothills. Opening bid $300. Ayanna climbed the 3 wooden steps of the platform. Her moccasins made no sound, but each step seemed to echo through the tense silence that settled over the small crowd. She wore a simple dark blue cotton dress, without ornaments, graying hair braided with leather ribbons worn by time. No jewelry, no obvious symbol of her cultural heritage. Just a middle-aged woman who seemed to carry the weight of the world on her shoulders. The men shifted restlessly. Some spat on the ground. Others whispered comments she pretended not to hear. Local farmers, town merchants, land speculators from Phoenix. They all had one thing in common: they saw that land as a profit opportunity. "What the hell does she want here?" muttered someone in the second row. "Probably to cause trouble again," replied another, adjusting his hat to better cover his eyes from the sun. The auctioneer hesitated, looking nervously at Ayanna. "Ma'am, this is a public sale, but if you don't intend to bid." She stared at him in silence. Her dark eyes reflected decades of peaceful resistance, of dignity maintained in the face of constant humiliation. She didn't say a word, but her presence communicated volumes. That land wasn't just 400 acres of arid soil to her. It was the place where her great-grandparents had held sacred ceremonies. Where generations of her family had been buried before the forced relocations. The wind blew stronger, raising small clouds of red dust. The rock formations in the background seemed like silent observers of this transaction that would reduce ancestral history to numbers on a legal deed. $300, shouted a farmer from the front row, breaking the heavy silence. $350, countered another. Ayanna remained motionless, but Benjamin Crawford saw something in her eyes that deeply disturbed him. It wasn't anger. It wasn't despair. It was a sadness so profound it seemed to have roots deeper than the ancient cottonwoods that grew near the old trading post. He had seen that look before, years ago, during events that still haunted his sleep. The bidding continued around her as if she were invisible. 400. 450. 500. Each number drove another nail into the coffin of memory, another step away from the sacred ground where her ancestors' spirits still walked according to the old stories. Then something unexpected happened. Benjamin Crawford stepped forward from the shadow of his truck. The crowd turned to look at the tall, weathered man who had lived in these parts longer than most of them had been alive. His boots kicked up small clouds of dust as he walked toward the platform, but it wasn't the sound of his steps that made everyone fall silent. It was the piece of white cloth he pulled from his shirt pocket and tied to a stick he picked up from the ground. The white flag fluttered in the desert wind like a ghost from another time. Benjamin Crawford's weathered hands gripped the makeshift staff as he approached the platform, his boots echoing on the hard-packed earth. The crowd fell into an uncomfortable silence, broken only by the distant cry of a red-tailed hawk circling overhead. "What's Crawford doing?" whispered Tom Martinez, a local cattle dealer who had known Benjamin for over 20 years. Nobody answered because nobody understood. Ayanna watched the old rancher approach, her expression unreadable. She had heard stories about Benjamin Crawford. How he had fought alongside cavalry units in the Indian wars of his youth. How his ranch had expanded over lands that once belonged to her people. How he had voted in favor of every motion to restrict native movement through the territory. Yet here he stood, carrying a symbol of surrender. The auctioneer, clearly flustered by this unexpected interruption, tapped his gavel nervously against the wooden podium. "Mr. Crawford, sir, if you'd like to place a bid, please do so in the normal manner. We can't have disruptions." Benjamin ignored him completely. He stopped 3 feet from the platform and looked directly into Ayanna's eyes. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the two faced each other across decades of mistrust and pain. The crowd held its collective breath. "Ma'am," Benjamin said quietly, his voice carrying despite its low tone. "I believe we need to talk." Harold Whitman, the largest landowner in the county, pushed forward from the back of the crowd. His face was red with indignation and the heat. "Crawford, what the devil has gotten into you? This is business, not some peace treaty nonsense." "Maybe that's been the problem all along, Harold," Benjamin replied without taking his eyes off Ayanna. "Maybe we've been treating this as just business when it should have been about something more." The murmurs grew louder. Some men stepped closer, forming a tighter circle around the platform. Others backed away, sensing trouble brewing. Sarah Beth Coleman, the only woman in the crowd besides Ayanna, clutched her husband's arm nervously. She ran the general store in town and had always treated the native customers with respect, but she had never seen anything like this public display. Ayanna finally spoke, her voice clear and steady despite the tension crackling through the air like electricity before a thunderstorm. "You speak of talk, Mr. Crawford. But your people have been talking about our land for 50 years. Talking while taking. Talking while moving us. Talking while burying our sacred places under your cattle and your fences." Her words cut through the desert air with surgical precision. Several men removed their hats, suddenly uncomfortable under the blazing sun. Benjamin Crawford felt each word like a physical blow, but he didn't flinch. "You're right," he said simply. "We've done a lot of talking and not much listening." The auctioneer tried again to regain control. "Folks, we have a schedule to maintain. If there are no more bids on Lot 17. $1,000, Benjamin Crawford said loudly, never breaking eye contact with Ayanna. The crowd erupted. $1,000 was more than most of them made in a year. It was certainly more than the dusty plot of land was worth for grazing or farming. Harold Whitman sputtered in disbelief. "Crawford, you've lost your mind. That land's not worth half that amount." "Depends on how you measure worth, Harold," Benjamin replied calmly. He finally turned to face the crowd, the white flag still in his hand. "Some things can't be measured in dollars and cents." Ayanna studied the weathered rancher with new interest. She had expected many things when she climbed onto that platform, but not this. Not a gesture that acknowledged the sacred nature of the land her people were about to lose forever. The auctioneer, seeing dollar signs, quickly recovered his composure. $1,000 from Mr. Crawford. "Do I hear 1,100? The silence stretched on. Nobody else had that kind of money, especially not to spend on what they considered worthless desert scrubland. Finally, the auctioneer raised his gavel. "Going once, going twice." "Wait," Ayanna said, stepping forward on the platform. Every eye turned to her. "I would like to speak with Mr. Crawford. Privately." The crowd began to protest, but Benjamin Crawford raised his hand, the white flag moving with the gesture. "Give us 5 minutes," he said. "Just 5 minutes." They walked away from the crowd toward a cluster of ancient cottonwood trees that provided the only shade for miles. The trees had stood there long before the first European settlers arrived, their roots reaching deep into the earth, drawing life from underground springs that had sustained Ayanna's ancestors for countless generations. Benjamin stuck the white flag in the sandy soil between them and removed his hat, revealing hair that had once been black but was now silver-white. Deep lines etched his face, each one telling a story of harsh desert winters and scorching summers. His hands, gnarled from decades of ranch work, trembled slightly as he spoke. 43 years ago, I was 20 years old and thought I knew everything about right and wrong, he began, his voice barely audible above the whisper of wind through the cottonwood leaves. I rode with Captain Morrison's unit during the roundup at Canyon de Chelly. Ayanna's breath caught. Canyon de Chelly was sacred ground, the place where hundreds of her people had been forced from their traditional homes and marched to internment at Bosque Redondo. It was a wound that had never fully healed in the tribal memory. My grandfather was at Canyon de Chelly, she said quietly. He was 12 years old when they came. Benjamin nodded, his eyes fixed on the red cliffs in the distance. We told ourselves we were following orders. That it was for the greater good. That progress required sacrifices. He paused, struggling with words that had remained unspoken for decades. I saw things that day that changed me. Things no man should see. Children crying for parents who had been separated from them. Old people collapsing on the march because they couldn't keep up. The auctioneer's voice drifted over from the platform, trying to move on to the next lot, but the crowd remained focused on the two figures under the trees. Some men had moved closer, straining to hear the conversation that could change everything. There was an old woman, Benjamin continued, his voice growing stronger despite the pain in his words. She must have been 70, maybe older. She carried a small bundle wrapped in doeskin. When the soldiers told her to drop it, she refused. Said it contained sacred objects that couldn't be abandoned. Ayanna felt her heart racing. She knew this story, had heard variations of it from other survivors, but never from someone who had been there as a soldier. They took the bundle from her, Benjamin said, his hands clenching into fists. Threw it on the ground. When she tried to retrieve it, one of the younger soldiers, one of my friends, he struck her with his rifle butt. The weight of 43 years of guilt hung in the air between them like desert heat. Ayanna watched this man who had lived with this secret for longer than many people lived at all. I didn't stop him, Benjamin whispered. I was 20 years old, and I didn't stop him. What was her name? Ayanna asked. Benjamin looked up, surprised by the question. I don't know. We weren't told their names. They were just numbers to us. Her name was Esther Nayeli. She was my great-grandmother. The words hit Benjamin like a physical blow. He staggered backward, leaning against the rough bark of the cottonwood tree for support. The irony was too cruel, too perfect. Here he stood, decades later, facing the descendant of the woman whose dignity he had failed to protect. The bundle contained sacred corn pollen and prayers written on birch bark by her grandmother, Ayanna continued, her voice steady despite the tears that had begun to flow down her weathered cheeks. She spent the rest of her life trying to remember those prayers so she could teach them to her children. Benjamin Crawford, the man who had built a successful ranch empire and commanded respect throughout the territory, fell to his knees in the red dust beneath the cottonwood trees. I'm sorry, he whispered. God help me, I'm so sorry. The crowd had grown restless, and several men were walking toward the trees. Harold Whitman led the group, his face flushed with anger and confusion. Crawford, he shouted. What kind of fool nonsense is this? Get up from there and act like a man. But Ayanna was already moving. She stepped forward and placed her hand on Benjamin's shoulder, a gesture that stopped Harold Whitman in his tracks and sent murmurs rippling through the approaching crowd. Mr. Crawford, she said clearly, loud enough for everyone to hear. I accept your offer. The words hung in the desert air like smoke from a sacred fire. Benjamin Crawford looked up from where he knelt, confusion and hope warring in his weathered features. The approaching crowd stopped as if they had hit an invisible wall, their angry murmurs dying away to uncertain silence. What do you mean? Benjamin asked, struggling to his feet with dignity he wasn't sure he deserved. Ayanna turned to face the crowd of men who had gathered under the cottonwood trees. Her voice carried the authority of someone who had spent decades mediating disputes and healing rifts within her community. I mean that you have offered $1,000 for sacred land, and I accept your offer. But not as a purchase. As a partnership. Harold Whitman pushed forward, his face red with outrage. Now see here, you can't just change the terms of a legal auction. This is America, not some tribal council meeting. Mr. Whitman, Ayanna replied calmly, this is America. Which means all Americans have the right to make agreements with each other, including this American. She gestured to herself with quiet pride. Benjamin Crawford found his voice. What kind of partnership are you proposing, ma'am? The auctioneer had abandoned his platform and joined the crowd, his ledger book clutched against his chest. Folks, I need to remind everyone that this is a government land sale with specific legal requirements. The legal requirements will be met, Ayanna said firmly. Mr. Crawford will purchase the land at the agreed price. But he will also enter into a covenant that recognizes the sacred nature of this place and ensures its protection for future generations. Sarah Beth Coleman stepped forward from the edge of the crowd. As the town's unofficial keeper of community news, she understood the historical significance of what was unfolding. What exactly does that mean, Miss Ayanna? It means the land will be used for grazing, as Mr. Crawford intended, but certain areas will remain untouched. The burial grounds. The prayer sites. The places where our ancestors walked. Ayanna looked directly at Benjamin. It means we work together to heal old wounds instead of creating new ones. An elderly farmer named Pete Morrison, nephew of the captain Benjamin had mentioned, spat into the dust. Sounds like a bunch of sentimental nonsense to me. Land is land. Use it or lose it. Pete, Benjamin said quietly, his voice carrying authority that commanded attention, I've been using land my whole life. Sometimes I've used it wisely, sometimes not. But I've never had a chance to heal it before. The crowd was growing restless again, but this time the energy felt different. Less angry, more curious. Tom Martinez, the cattle dealer, asked the question many were thinking. Crawford, what changed your mind? Yesterday you were bidding against the Hendersons for the water rights on Willow Creek. Today you're making deals with my neighbor, Benjamin finished firmly. Today I'm making deals with my neighbor. Ayanna reached into the small leather pouch she carried and withdrew a handful of white corn pollen, the same sacred substance her great-grandmother had carried in her bundle decades ago. She scattered it on the wind, watching as it drifted across the red earth toward the distant mesas. In my language, she said, we have a phrase, Hazon Hazliai. It means walking in beauty, living in harmony with all living things. For too long, we have not walked in beauty together. The auctioneer cleared his throat nervously. Well, if Mr. Crawford wants to complete the purchase, we need to finalize the paperwork. We'll complete it, Benjamin said, extending his hand toward Ayanna. Partners? She looked at his outstretched hand for a long moment, considering all the history that led to this moment. Then she clasped it firmly. Partners. The handshake lasted only seconds, but its impact rippled through the crowd like stones thrown into still water. Some men nodded approval. Others shook their heads in bewilderment. Harold Whitman stormed off toward his automobile, muttering about the world going crazy. As the crowd began to disperse, Sarah Beth Coleman approached the unlikely partners. This will be big news, she said. People will want to know what happens next. Ayanna smiled, the first genuine smile she had shown all day. What happens next is the hardest part. We learn to keep promises we make to each other. Benjamin Crawford picked up the white flag from where he had planted it in the earth. The fabric was already dusty from the desert wind, but it no longer looked like surrender. It looked like hope. 6 months later, the first joint council meeting between the Crawford Ranch and the local Navajo community would establish the precedent for land partnerships that would spread throughout the Southwest. The sacred burial grounds would remain untouched, while sustainable grazing practices would improve the health of the entire ecosystem. But that afternoon, under the cottonwood trees, all they had were words and the courage to trust each other. As the sun began to set behind the red cliffs, painting the desert in shades of gold and purple, Ayanna and Benjamin walked back toward their respective communities, each carrying the weight and promise of a new beginning. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Stories of courage and reconciliation need to be shared, and your support helps us bring more powerful true stories to light. Drop a comment below. What historical moment would you like to see us explore next? Share this video with someone who believes in the power of understanding between different communities. Together, we can ensure these important stories reach the people who need to hear them most. Thank you for being part of our community of storytellers.